Greetings, everybody. This is we're looking at Thomas Jefferson here, looking at Learning Objective 1. We're discussing the election of 1800 and the arrival of what is referred to as Jeffersonian Democracy. So the first thing we want to understand about the election of 1800 is that it was basically tied in the Electoral College between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr with 73 votes. So according to the Constitution, when there is a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. And the Speaker of the House is Hamilton, and although he does not like Jefferson, he hates Aaron Burr even more. And so he's able to lobby Congress effectively to cast the vote towards Jefferson. This confusion, and what's going to happen too, is Burr is going to become his vice president because he comes in second place. Now, that was the original formation of the Constitution. The person who got second place would become vice president. Now, Burr is from a different party. He is than Jefferson, so we have that awkward situation going on here. And nobody particularly likes Burr for a variety of reasons. So what is done in Congress is they pass the 12th Amendment, which basically puts the president and the vice president on the same ticket. So it's not, it doesn't go to the person who wins second place anymore, right? So that's the one and only time that's ever happened. What the election of 1800 constitutes more than anything is a revolution, and this is what Jefferson will call it. He will call it a political revolution, a bloodless revolution, as he would put it. And this election is pretty remarkable if you take in consideration that this is one of the first times, it is actually the first time that two diverging political ideologies, that is the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans, who really do have a different vision of how the country should evolve. The Federalists believe the federal government should have a greater role over the state governments, where the Democratic Republicans believe that the states should maintain a great degree of their autonomy. The Federalists believe in the merits of a hierarchy and the merits of an aristocracy as well. Where the Democratic Federalists understand that the push towards the push and the future of the United States lies in really opening up the democratic process as much as possible, given their time. So even the idea of universal white male suffrage is going to be revolutionary, and this is something the Democratic Republicans are going to lead the way toward. It sounds pretty quaint to our ears that white men get to vote, but you have to keep in mind that the only people that were able to vote at this time were white males with not just some property, but substantial amount of property, generally speaking, in most electorate precincts. So you have these diverging views of the future of the government, right? Another difference between the Federalists is that they believe the economy should be led by industry, where Democratic Republicans are going to be more towards what's referred to as a yeoman farmer. In agriculture, having basically self-assured, independent farmers who are self-sustaining. They don't have to rely on finance and other institutions to sustain themselves, and they could sell the products that the land produces to earn currency, the cash that they might need. So these are the different visions. This election is essentially won by the Democratic Republicans, and there is no bloodshed as a result. This is even actually, we should be even in awe that this doesn't happen today in many countries. It does happen in a lot of countries around the world, even to this day. We're seeing quite a bit of this going on in some of the Middle Eastern countries that are kind of vying for the future of that region in many ways, including Egypt, and we're seeing this in Syria. We're seeing this in Libya, right? This is the normal course of action in human events. The Constitution in the election of 1800, you want to keep in mind, is 12 years old. What this election demonstrates is that if the Constitution is followed with the transfer of power, it works. And the Constitution provides this transfer of power despite whatever current power, in this case the Federalists were currently in power, and they willingly stepped down. They didn't have to do that. In reality, in practical terms, they could have raised armies. Hamilton had experience with this. They had the wealth to do it, and they could have gone after the Democratic Republicans, and we could have had a civil war right from the get-go and seeing the dissolution of the Republic. So very remarkable, the election of 1800 in that regard. And so the country is changing. The Federalists have demonstrated themselves to be not trusted by the American voters at this time, the eligible voters at this time. So the Federalist Party is splitting. They're not trusted because of things that we have discussed with John Adams. John Adams with his Alien and Sedition Acts. This idea of curtailing the First Amendment seems to be a arbitrary use of power, right? And so the Federalist Party within the Federalist Congress was able to dictate how people and when people could criticize the government. And people were in prison, and people were fined for criticizing the government. And it was very clear to people, it was very transparent to people that the Federalists were targeting Democratic Republicans. So people that were convicted for the Alien and Sedition Act, basically the Alien Act lengthened the time that one could become a naturalized citizen from 5 to 14 years. And this was targeting many immigrant groups from Ireland and Scotland and France would be voting for Democratic Republicans given their political stance, and so this was targeting that electorate pool. People that were arrested for the Sedition Act, which basically said that you could not criticize the federal government or the president in any way, were mainly Democratic Republican editors. Matthew Lyon, a Democratic Republican, a member of Congress. Other private individuals were targeted for the Sedition Act as well. So all total, there were 25 people arrested. Of them, 11 were tried. One died awaiting trial. But 10 were convicted of sedition, often in trials before openly partisan federal judges. So the American people just don't trust the Federalists anymore with this power. And the Federalists are trying to hold on to kind of this old order of power, of hierarchy. So John Adams is the last Federalist president, and he really was despite his many strengths as a leader, he really was the epitome of somebody who, because of the virtue of who he was, educated, refined, wealthy, people should defer to his authority. Those sentiments are beginning to change, and the Democratic Republicans, people like Jefferson, understood this. And so one of the first things he's going to do as president is to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, pardon anyone who was convicted, pay the fines of anyone who was fined with interest, to let people know that this was not going to be the way of the future for the United States of America. And the other thing Jefferson is going to do, so what Jefferson's going to, there's several changes that Jefferson is going to bring about into the very concept of the presidency, in contrast to what the Federalists had developed under Washington and John Adams from 1789, when Washington was first elected, to 1800, when John Adams finishes his first term and is not reelected and loses as Thomas Jefferson. First and foremost, the attitude of government is going to change. Jefferson is going to be really the first president to reside in Washington. The capital used to be in Philadelphia, and it's unfinished, and he really does not take any means to really finishing Washington. It's carved out of a marsh. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. Out in front of the White House are grazing cows. The only road that leads to what will be known later as the White House it basically ends into a cow path, right? And so you could imagine foreign dignitaries, ambassadors from Europe, established civilizations that had centuries and centuries of history behind them, coming to the United States, to the Capitol, and seeing this kind of situation. From Jefferson's standpoint, this is ideal because it expresses an attitude about what the federal government should be. The federal government should be a weakened entity. Jefferson, as many Democratic Republicans, believe that if you allow the federal government to have too much power, it's going to lead to corruption, it's going to lead to tyranny, and it will basically reverse all of the gains that the American Revolution produced. This is Jefferson's attitude, his argument and his idea. So he presents a very humble federal government through just the expression of where the capital is and how it is laid out. He is very informal in his appearance as president. There are many accounts of people aghast, shocked, and even insulted of how he welcomes people into the White House, mainly coming from foreign dignitaries, ambassadors from England and France and Portugal and the Netherlands. He would basically show up in slippers and unkept clothes and unkept hair. He didn't wear the powdered wig. So Jefferson was expressing this view in a very deliberate way. Now, in his personal life, he did live the good life, right? And he did import some of the finer things from Europe. So he is a man of contradictions, but he does make an attempt to lower the status of the appearance of the federal government. Another thing that he would contrast himself from Federalist, George Washington was known to travel in a very beautiful carriage with 6 white, well-groomed, bred horses. Jefferson either walked or rode his own horse. And so you could be in Washington conducting business, being there, and somebody walks by and you wonder who that was, and somebody tells you, oh, that's the President of the United States. And that would have been in stark contrast to the way that particularly George Washington expressed power. He's going to greatly reduce the size of the military. And why is he going to do this? Mainly because of the next point, or the fourth point here. He is worried about the national debt. So the Federalists leave Jefferson with a $120 million deficit. He's worried about this because that deficit is tied to banks in New England, and he does not want bankers in New England to have that much power. So he is going to greatly reduce the military. We're not going to have a standing professional army. That costs money. So he's able to save a lot of money that way. He basically tells his treasurer, Albert Gallatin, to basically reduce $7 million a year from the federal budget. And the federal budget brings in about $9 million in revenue. So he's only saying we're going to work with $2 million a year. So he has to figure out ways of reducing the amount of money that the federal government spends. So reduce the military. He's going to reduce the amount of federal employees. Mainly, he's going to do that with a lot of ambassadors. So we maintain embassies in England, in Spain, and in France. But he closes embassies in lots of other countries in England or throughout Europe. Other countries that we don't have really established relations with, seeing it as a waste of money. He's going to greatly reduce the amount of employees throughout the country because it's a way of saving money. And he is very interested in saving money because he wants to reduce the power of bankers that have over the federal government. And you want to keep in mind, he is a Southerner, and he is worried about the North gaining too much power and influence over the federal government at the expense of the South. So in many, many ways, the seeds of what will become the Civil War in 1860 are definitely laid out in the early years of the Republic. He's going to repeal the Alien and Sedition Act, and he's doing this because the Alien and Sedition Act clearly were a detour from the revolutionary rhetoric of the war and of independence. He's going to cut taxes. There were property taxes imposed through Hamiltonian economics. The whiskey tax, he's going to cut that as well. Basically trying to reduce the stranglehold and the very presence of the federal government. And again, he's going to increase the power of agriculture in the South. He's an expansionist. He wants to expand the federal government. He wants to expand the United States out because he believes, and this is a different vision of Hamilton's, he believes the future of the American government, of the American of America, of the United States of America, is going to lie again in these yeoman farmers, these independent farmers who will not be corrupted as people were in European civilizations and European nation states, because they would be independent. And the key to independence is agricultural, according to Hamilton, because you can be self-sustaining. You don't have to take out loans with banks, in other words, in order to sustain yourself from day to day. He's going to try to have free trade without government control. That's one of his goals. He's not necessarily going... We'll look at later in Learning Objective some of these contradictions that rise up, and the Embargo Act is definitely going to be a contradiction of his view on free trade. But he does have a vision when he first becomes president of getting the government out of the idea of trade, especially through the use of tariffs, which Hamilton was very big on. He wants to eliminate that idea whatsoever. He's going to reduce the size of the national bank, but he's not going to get rid of it. He begins to understand the value of the national bank, but he does try to, and is successful in reducing the size of it. But the national bank will maintain. So that'll sum up basically the concept one for Jefferson. Again, the election of 1800, revolutionary in the fact that it was a bloodless revolution, according to Jefferson, and a pretty amazing feat that power was surrendered, respecting the transfer of power under the structure of the Constitution. And then this idea of Jeffersonian democracy, of trying to curtail the vision of the Federalists and the size and scope of the federal government. Again, you can begin to see the seeds of tensions, sectional tensions between the North and the South through Jefferson's vision as they begin to mount. and it centers on this vision, this idea of the size and scope of the federal government. As we're going to see in later learning objectives, Jefferson, despite his ideals, is going to succumb to a lot of Federalist ideals when it comes to the scope and power of the federal government. So look for that in the coming learning objectives. Here we're mainly dealing with a lot of his ideals as in his early presidency. And to his credit, he did fulfill a lot of these ideals, but he's going to change his tune as time progresses when he becomes president. That's all I have for now. I'll talk with you guys later. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Email me or get me through Sally. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.